Hey, thanks for joining us here on the Gill Athletics Connections podcast. I'm your host, Mike Cunningham, and I'm just so stoked, so humbled. Before we get to today's guest, it's awesome. We're hitting here in season 3. I would never have guessed starting in January of 2020 that we would even remotely see a season 3. So if you are a returning listener, God bless you. Thank you so much for being here. You're awesome. So humbled. If this is your first time, hey, welcome. This is great. I can't wait to intro season 10 one day and see all the changes and all the coaches that we've had here. Now, if you've seen the name of the podcast today, our guest, you're probably wondering where maybe you've seen his name for coaching track. Maybe he's a high school coach. Maybe he's a college coach. Stop your worried little mind here. Unfortunately, because we love track coaches, today's guest is not a track coach, but we're going to be talking about leadership. This is why I wanted to have today's guest with us today. It's really an important topic for our track coaches on all levels, in the summer youth coaches up to our pro elite coaches. I'm super psyched to have Dr. Matthew Raidbard here with us today. Matthew, how are you, sir?
I'm great. Excited to be here.
And I'm excited for you to be here. Our podcast here at the Gill Connections podcast is all about coaches, and specifically track and field coaches. We want to uplift and honor the amazing journey that they have in this great sport. And on top of that, one of our goals here is to continually bring value to our listeners, which are primarily track coaches. Shocker, I know. So I'm just super excited to have you here today to talk about this book that you wrote, your research, and kind of just, stoke some conversation today about what leadership means and how it affects the young people that we get to coach out there.
Yeah, absolutely. Looking forward to it.
So let's start with Matthew wrote a book that I've had the honor to read. You've got to go pick it up. It's amazing, actually. It's a quick read. It's not one of these 300 pagers either, man. He did a good job of cutting out fluff and just giving you the big stuff here. So his book is called Lead Like a Pro: Effective Leadership Styles for Athletic Coaches. And you're going to learn here in a second. You'll see on the cover, and we'll have the links down in the show notes, of course. There's a basketball goal. Now, that's not a track. Now, I do love basketball. Our other half of our company is basketball and volleyball and stuff. So, Matthew, why don't you give us a start? Kind of give us your LinkedIn profile here. Give us, kind of your background in athletics and leadership and why you're even on the podcast today.
Yeah, absolutely. I got started, not in track and field, but in men's basketball. I was a men's college basketball coach for over a decade at Division I, and had the opportunity to, be a coach at several different schools. And, actually kind of backing it up, my first job was at a small Division II school called Western New Mexico University. And when I got that job, in order for me to be an assistant coach, I had to be enrolled in a graduate program. And my dream had been to, be a college basketball coach. I really hadn't, thought about going to graduate school, but if I had to do it in order to be a coach, I was going to do whatever it took. So I got down to Western New Mexico, and I saw my advisor, and she told me there were only 2 programs that I could get into. One was counseling and one was educational leadership. And we kind of went through the pros and cons of both, and I could see how they were both applicable to what I was doing as a coach. But when we got to the end, there was that timeline to graduation, and everything was exactly the same: 2 years, 4 semesters, except counseling required a 6-hour additional summer internship in the middle. So based off of that, I chose educational leadership. And, I had no idea the impact it would have on my life at the time. And it would actually take me several years before I really understood that impact it would have on me professionally. But eventually I would go back to school for educational leadership and pursue a doctorate while I was coaching, and conduct research and write the book. But that was really that starting point for me understanding how important leadership was for athletic coaches.
I'm always amazed. We look back at it now because we have perspective, right? Looking behind us is 2020, but these forks in the roads that we don't think are all that big in the moment. So you have counseling and educational leadership, and you're like, yeah, an extra semester. Yeah, I'll go over here. I'm just here to coach, man. That's what I really want to do. So I'll go over here, and look where it has led you from that small decision. I love that. That is just so cool to see. So you went and got a PhD. I'm from Alabama. I have a hard time spelling PhD. Talk to us about that process and how you picked it's a thesis, right? I'm not joking when I say I don't know much about it. I barely got my undergrad, Matthew. So, you're several levels ahead of me educationally, my man. So talk to us about the thesis, what you chose and how you chose it, and what it was all about.
Yeah, it kind of goes back to that first decision to get into educational leadership right out of college and pursue a master's. You know, Once I started getting an introduction to leadership practice, learning about leadership styles and how applicable they were for me as a coach, I started looking around for more educational opportunities, books on leadership for coaches, trainings, different things. And there just weren't very many. There were a lot of books by successful coaches telling me how they did it, which is very valuable. It's great to hear different perspectives and see what other people are doing. But that's not necessarily the way I should do it because I'm not them. And it's not telling me necessarily how I can do it. It's just telling me how they did it. And kind of looking for other leadership opportunities, a lot of them were more for management, or they were geared towards networking. They weren't really leadership specific. So then I went to my friends in other professions, and there were so many resources for them. There were tons of leadership resources. They were getting tons of leadership professional development. So I started, reading some of those books, doing some of those kind of professional development opportunities. And they were very helpful, but they were all geared towards managing adults, professionals, because that's who my friends in the business world were managing. I was managing 18 to 22-year-olds. Other coaches are managing 10-year-olds, 14-year-olds, high school kids, whatever it is. That requires a different set of leadership skills, a different leadership practice. So over time, I had just always thought there weren't enough of these resources specific for coaches at all levels of sports. And so when I went back to school to pursue a doctorate in educational leadership, it was twofold. One was to be able to continue my development in leadership and help me as a coach and as a professional. But it was also to be able to try to figure out a way for me to contribute to where I felt like there was this gap, that there weren't these resources for coaches. And that's what led to my thesis, which was intended to do research and figure out what are the best leadership styles and behaviors for coaches to practice. So I could then take this research and tell coaches, here's some great leadership styles and behaviors for you that are going to help you be successful.
Yeah, I love that. You're right. A lot of these books that are out there are geared towards managing other adults. And at the end of the day, specifically on the high school to college level, we're dealing with 14 to 22-year-olds who are not adults. They're still forming who they're going to become. Their brain is still growing. So I love that, this passion of coaching of yours, plus add the educational component of it, helped build into this research and this thesis. So one of the things, and by the way, disclaimer, he's a basketball guy and we're track people, so he's going to give a lot of basketball analogies. He's promised me a few track ones as well, though. But I actually have a couple of basketball questions for him. It's going to blow his mind. He did not see this one coming. So but stick with us on the basketball analogies. I know on the track and field side, this is 100% applicable, and that's why we had Matthew here today. So Matthew, when you talk about leadership, so one of the things that the theme of your book, and I really, really enjoyed it. And by the way, someone who doesn't coach kids anymore, so I'm the person dealing with adults, but haven't had a career coaching college track and field. What I loved about your book and your theme, if you will, was this perceived leadership style versus actual leadership style. Before we get into those, you kind of boil it down to 5 coaching styles. Before we get into that, can you help us understand, what does that mean, my perceived leadership style versus my actual leadership style? What's that mean?
Yeah, so this was something that came up during my research. I was collecting just kind of demographic background information early on, and I basically asked coaches, and I was asking college coaches, of these leadership styles, here's a bunch of leadership styles, here's a bunch of definitions. Which leadership style do you think you're practicing? Do you think you're a transformational leader based on this definition of transformational leadership? Do you think you're a servant leader or any other leadership style? And then I had them take a survey that determined what their actual leadership style was. So based on the answers to all of these leadership questions, I could then do some fancy math and plug things into a fancy program and determine which leadership styles they were actually practicing based on their answers. And when I went back and I said, I looked at, the coaches, what they told me that their leadership style was, and I looked at what their actual leadership styles were, that's when I determined there was a big gap between leadership styles coaches as a population thought they were practicing versus what they were actually practicing.
Now that's super interesting. That caught me off guard. So, having my whole life is centered around track coaches specifically. And there's some amazingly talented leaders, self-aware leaders, servant leader. I mean, at the end of the day, when you're not even dealing, that's not even the right word. When you are in charge with raising other people's kids, that's a big, and that's right up there, teachers, it's principals, academia, it's amazing, right? So I would have thought if you would have said, hey, Mike, so I did the survey, actual leadership versus their perceived, what do you think the gap was? I would have said not much. Like, okay, certainly because there's young coaches coming into the profession on a daily basis. There's, and I'm looking at the whole swath, new coaches to veteran coaches. Certainly there are some people that are still finding their way, right? So maybe it's 25, 30% gap. You found, like, I can't remember the words you used in the book, but it was like massive, essentially. Like there was a tremendous gap between the style that I think I'm doing as a coach versus their actual. Did that surprise you when you got the results?
So, I was very surprised. But then when I, looked more into the research and saw, one of the main components that made coaches successful was they had a much smaller gap, right? So once I was able to kind of piece together, successful coaches have figured out the leadership style that's best for them, that they want to practice and how to practice it. And coaches who have had inconsistent results, are new to coaching, are young, typically they're a little less successful. When I figured out that was more attributable to the fact that, their actual leadership style and their perceived leadership style were not really aligned, it kind of made more sense, right? Through experience, through education, through observation, mentoring, these more successful coaches gained this better idea of what leadership style was right for them and how to practice it. Whereas for other coaches that had that gap, they were missing some of those elements.
So I'm going to say it how I heard it. You correct me, Matthew. Coaches, as you got all the data back, as you looked at coaches that were more successful, and I assume, and I think you covered this in the book as well, you define success on the very, as coaches, trophy wise, meaning championships and things like that, right? Not necessarily how many kids
Right.
go on to college, right? Okay. Because that's a whole different side of what your success may be as a coach, but we're talking about, you're quote unquote paid to win a conference championship, go to nationals, place high, maybe win nationals, etc. So when you got to look at the data on a more minutia, you saw successful coaches were the ones that had a smaller gap versus maybe less successful coaches had the larger gap. So what I hear when you say that is that the self-awareness of your perceived style versus actual is really critical to winning games, winning track meets, winning championships. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, absolutely.
Mm-hmm. That and there you go. That's why we had Matthew on the podcast right there. It is all about self-awareness, right? Like it's great that you think one thing, and it's unfortunate if the reverse is actually true. The good news is you can get better, but you can't get better until you know those facts, right? So to me, that's why this was so important. The study that he did in the book that he wrote off of the results was, one, if you think you coach one way, if it's true, some people he took in the survey had to have gotten, like, they were on, their perceived was their actual. That's great. You keep like, that's a lot of validation. But if your perceived leadership is one way and the actual is different, well, there's a gap there. That's kind of the bad news. The good news is it can get better. So let's talk about, Matthew. Let's go through these 5 coaching styles. It's in chapter 4. So a lot of great lead up to what he's doing with this, with these studies and this education here. And then chapter 4, we get into the 5 coaching styles. Before you start with the first one, Matthew, is there we're going to go through these 5 styles. Is there one that's better than the other? So we're going to define these and talk about their characteristics as he does that. I want to make sure that there is one that's better, that you start kind of thinking about that one. Is there one better than the other in these 5?
So, here's what I'll say about that. The research shows that transformational leadership is most commonly practiced by the most successful coaches. That doesn't mean it's the leadership style that I could tell all of your listeners, if you practice this, you will be successful. But it's definitely a leadership style that is associated with successful coaches and also student athletes wanting coaches who practice it. So that's definitely a leadership style to pay attention to. I think a lot of coaches gravitate toward it. There's some other great leadership styles we're going to discuss that have some really great elements of them that coaches, might want to latch on to and incorporate into their practice. But as a foundational leadership practice, definitely transformational leadership was the most common among successful coaches.
That's awesome. So let's get started. I assume, at least in your book and on my list, number 1 is that transformational. So maybe we start there and talk to us. We can already start getting an idea. You named these perfectly. Transformational coaching. Like I can already start thinking of what I think that means. Let's define the first style here: transformational leadership.
Yeah, for coaching, I think the key element of transformational leadership that I think a lot of coaches will gravitate to or have heard about is the kind of inspirational motivation component. So it's the idea that your job as a coach is to, 1, inspire your athletes to work to achieve more than they thought they could on their own, and motivate your athletes to reach for goals and accomplish things that they thought that were not possible for them on their own. So it's your job as a coach to inspire and motivate your athletes to be better, to be greater. And I think that's the element that resonates with a lot of coaches. And I think a lot of coaches feel like that is a big part of their job and why they got into coaching, to motivate and inspire. It's also about building really strong personal relationships with your athletes through a lot of one-on-one or individual consideration, where you're really getting to know them on a personal level and understanding their needs and using that as kind of a template for how you coach them, for how you provide that inspiration and motivation. I think those are the really 2 big aspects that a lot of coaches gravitate to with transformational leadership.
So I think of that picture, I believe it's Kareem Abdul-Jabbar with John Wooden, and there's the picture of when Kareem was an athlete and young John Wooden, and then older Kareem and really old John Wooden, and he's helping John Wooden onto the to the court, probably for a Hall of Fame induction or something. One of a million John Wooden deservedly is in, and I think of that, right? Transformation, like, oh, he knew Kareem as an 18-year-old, and they still have a relationship 40 years or whatever the time frame would be down the line. Is that the kind of transformational? Am I on with that kind of example?
Yeah, absolutely. And the idea there being that, coach was able to build a relationship with him based on mutual trust and respect that transcended the typical coach athlete relationship that's kind of relegated to the court or the field or the track. It's about knowing each other on a personal level, on a human level. And then because you have that trust in one another, your athletes are more likely to take that inspiration and motivation and be able to trust that what you're telling them, even though they can't see it for themselves or they may not understand it, is something that they should still strive for and work for and push themselves towards.
You said this was the one coaches most self-identified with, correct? Did I get that right?
Yeah.
Why is it? Why this one? Is it because it's the most I don't know, I'm gonna call it Hollywoodish, meaning that, like, I start thinking about a lot of movies of football and Rudy and oh gosh, what's the name of the movie? The football movie with Sunshine and oh man, people are yelling at us right now listening to the podcast.
Remember the Titans.
Remember the Titans. Thank you very much.
Yep.
Great movie. I should know that title. But I'm thinking of like those type of, big Hollywood movies of sports. And those are I feel like those are transformational coaches from what you described. Is that why most coaches self-identify with transformational? Because it's like the most aspirational of the styles?
Yeah, I think that's such a great point, that if you are reading a definition of transformational leadership, and thinking about, well, there's inspiration, there's motivation, there's building relationships, there's positive communication. It sounds really great as a leader. Those are a lot of characteristics that we hope to see in ourselves as coaches, and we hope our athletes see in us as coaches. So I absolutely think you're totally on track there, that a lot of coaches want to identify with it or see themselves in that light. Now, whether or not they're actually practicing it was what was kind of uncovered in the research, but definitely a lot of coaches are going to gravitate towards that. I think also the idea of transformational leadership is kind of this transcending the idea of what a typical coach is. So it's, there's X's and O's, and there's breaking down film, and there's giving your athletes instruction. But then there's like this higher order of coaching to where I'm taking it to another level of coaching. I am now going to help you be this greater version of yourself, this greater version of the team. And I think that idea for coaches is kind of a lot of the reason why they got into coaching, to kind of help their athletes be even better and achieve more than they thought they could. So I think transformational leadership really ties in a lot with why coaches are in coaching, and what I think a lot of us put on a pedestal of the greatest coaches.
Yeah, it makes sense. Like as I was reading the transformational and, hearing that most coaches self-identify with that and not necessarily their actual, is that the first person, and it probably helped that, your undergrad is from Indiana, but I thought of Bobby Knight and I was like, okay, I don't feel like when I read the description, I don't feel like Bobby Knight fits here. But I felt like Bobby Knight would actually in his head think, oh yeah, I'm a transformational leader. Like that was his style. I help people. And I was like, and we'll learn as we go through these styles, maybe Bobby Knight fits in a different coaching style as we move along here. Should we move to the second one? Is that good for transformational?
Yeah, absolutely.
All right. Number 2, transactional. Again, I hear that descriptor, transactional leadership, and I can start kind of thinking what that might look like as a track coach. So give us some descriptions and examples of transactional leadership.
Yeah. So, transactional leadership is, transformational leadership, I think, is a leadership style over the last 10, 15, 20 years has gained in popularity, not only as coaching has changed and evolved, but also as the needs of athletes have evolved and what athletes are looking for in coaches. A lot of research suggests that athletes are looking for coaches who practice transformational behaviors. They react better to positivity and inspiration and motivation than other forms of coaching. Transactional leadership is a leadership style that I think once I start explaining it, a lot of your coaching listeners are going to say, oh, I know a coach from my past who practiced transactional leadership. It's not quite as common now, but I think coaches are still using it every now and then to kind of change things up or put a little wrinkle or get their kids over the hump. So basically, it's a leadership style that's based on the fundamental idea of a contingent reward or punishment system. So the idea being that, I'm going to set up a drill. Me as a basketball coach, I'm trying to have my team be better at shooting, and we're struggling to get over the hump. So I'm going to set up a short-term goal where I want us to make, as a team, 100 shots in 5 minutes. And we just haven't been able to do it. So now I'm going to tell my team, if we can do it, we're going to get a reward. So we don't have to do it anymore. We move on to more fun drills, and we can take a break. If we don't do it, we have to run to the end of the court and back, and we've got to do it again. So the idea being the reward will help motivate us to really stay focused and accomplish this short-term goal, or the punishment will be a deterrent and hopefully achieve that same effect of we'll be focused because we won't want to run and do it again. It's very, like you said, transactional in nature. Do this to get this, do this, or you won't get that. And, that's definitely a leadership style that was a lot more common. And, nowadays you still see aspects of it, but it's definitely changed over the years.
Now, that basketball example, made a lot of sense. And I can think of some for football. For track, we don't have that as much, right? Because we're talking about skill acquisition, right? When you're making baskets or blocking assignments in football. For track, like if we're teaching a skill, whether it's a technique in javelin or the triple jump, if an athlete doesn't do it right, we don't punish athlete and make them run laps or think, it's because we're learning, we're doing a skill acquisition there. But we might have more on track, more of the rules-based stuff, meaning show up on practice on time, don't miss the bus, check in at the right time, things like that. Does that play into this transactional leadership style as well?
Yeah, absolutely. Transactional leadership is also about setting really standardized, uniform expectations up front. So, like you said, setting some of those rules, setting some of those standards, whether they're, you have to be on the bus 15 minutes early, or, we expect this level of, teamwork or commitment or focus. It's about establishing those standards up front and making sure that they're uniform for everyone. So no matter what event you're in, no matter what level you're at in the event, no matter you're standing on the team, everybody's held to that same standard and expectation.
I wonder how many people, as we were describing transformational leadership, are like, oh yeah, all in, that's me. And then just heard transactional, I was like, oh, we have rules. And if we have rules, that means we have consequences if we break them. That's transactional. And are like, oh crap, well now maybe that's me. Oh man, that doesn't sound as fun or as cool as transformational. It's like, see, we're learning. You got to learn these different styles and start identifying, and then find out reality and start meshing up. What else are we missing in transactional there?
I think the other thing that I'll say at this point is, coaches are going to practice, transformational leadership might be the foundation of your leadership practice. You might practice a bunch of different elements of transformational leadership, and that's great. But you might also practice a behavior of transactional or a behavior of another style we'll study. You could still consider yourself a transformational leader and kind of pick and choose from some other leadership styles to kind of round out your individual leadership practice. So you might be a transformational leader who practices, like you said, kind of the rule setting and expectation setting of transactional leadership, kind of combining those leadership styles that could help transactional leadership be more effective because it's got that transformational element behind it. So definitely, as people are listening to these styles, they might see themselves in a number of them, and that's all about building their unique leadership practice.
Oh, that's really important. I was going to ask you at the end of the 5, is it less about, because a lot of these type of books where they start, here's your 5 styles, here's your 3, disc profiling, here's your 4, etc. In my opinion, experience it's very pigeonholing. It's like, oh no, you either are this or you are not, black or white. And my experience with life and coaches and leadership and training is there's a lot of fuzzy edges that occur in there. So I'm glad you said that, as far as like, it's not, the goal is not that you are, you find that you're a transformational leader and you only do transformational leader things. In fact, to what maybe I just heard you say there, that actually might be to a detriment. You might need a little blend of some of these others that we're going to talk about. But is it, and maybe I'll save this question to the last, let's put a pinhole in this question. Let's make sure I ask it and you address it, Matthew, at the end when we get through the 5. Is it more about finding your dominant style and then what's the right word here, bringing those other styles in at the right time and density, the right amounts as well? Is that more of what this is? And put a pinhole, don't answer that yet till we get to all 5 of them. That's a little teaser. You got to listen to the whole podcast to get the answer to that. Although we probably common sense know the answer to that, but we want to hear it from the good doctor here. Okay, transformational leader, transactional leader. I had no movies examples to add for transactional, unfortunately. I didn't have like this, like maybe you remember the Titans. He was big on, right, he had to change the program, so he had a lot of rules and things that he had to do. So maybe he was as well. All right, so the third one, and you're gonna, again, when you hear these names, you're gonna have some immediate reaction to like, oh, I think I get it. Like, I love these names. Like, you did not make these like super high tech. You hear the name like, well, what in the world is that? Like, these are great descriptor names. So number 3 on the 5 coaching styles is Autocratic leadership style. So help us understand what that means, Matthew.
Yeah, autocratic leadership it's like transactional leadership. I think when we start describing it, coaches are going to think back to coaches in the past who have used it. It again was a leadership style that was a lot more common in previous generations, but it's based on the idea that the coach is the unquestioned leader of the team and responsible for mostly unilaterally making all team decisions with little to no input from team members. So, you're not getting your athletes' opinions. You're really just looking at situations based on your experiences and making all the decisions for the team because you're the coach. And I think that, whereas that one on paper, I think a lot of coaches kind of shied away from it because of how it might make them look. When you really think about it, if you're hired to be the coach, it's because you have the experience and the expertise to do the job. You also are responsible for making team decisions, and you're ultimately responsible for their outcomes. So if you frame it in that light, I think that could hopefully give coaches some better context to say it's okay to be autocratic at times. I'll give an example. If you've got a very young team, a very new team that doesn't have a lot of leadership coming from the athletes, you might need to be more autocratic because you're the only one who's, has the experience or the background to really contribute to team decision making. So, whereas, in other scenarios, it might not fit as well. It's okay, even though that name can be a little scary for coaches, it's okay to think about being autocratic at times. Also, sometimes autocratic leaders, you have to make quick decisions in high pressure or high stress situations as a coach. Well, you don't necessarily have time to get a lot of input from people. You've just got to make a decision. Well, that's more autocratic. So, even though that one kind of maybe on paper, I know a lot of coaches shied away from identifying with it. I hope that context gives coaches, a little bit of a better understanding of how, it's okay to be autocratic at times, or there are some situations where it could definitely be beneficial for them to tend towards that leadership style.
Yeah, a lot of coaches did a sigh of relief there, Matthew, when you said you have permission, that there are times when this is the right, because it does seem like, autocratic. And when you describe it, it's like, oh yeah, this is the coach no one likes. Like no one likes to be under this coach. But then you start thinking about whether it's young team, old team, what the actual context is, whether it's a decision in the middle of the track meet, or is this something about, what we're going to do as our theme for the year as a track team, et cetera. I think about this, and I can't remember if you used a football analogy in the book, but as we're recording this right now, there's a big thing going on in the NFL world. Urban Meyer, right? And what a great, I mean, guys like you who study leadership, you guys must be licking your chops. Like this has to be like what a great study, in real life study here, right? But Urban Meyer, the difference between coaching, because I thought about this when you said about inexperienced and then the opposite experience. Urban Meyer dealing with 18 to 22-year-olds when he's a college coach is different when he's dealing with a bunch of 25 to 35-year-olds, like experienced professionals making money, making important decisions. Like maybe his style doesn't work in the NFL in regards to that. And I think, again, you hear things and, don't necessarily know what's true and what's not true. But it does seem like maybe it's not a good fit, his style. It doesn't matter his coaching skill. I'm not talking about X's and O's. We're talking about dealing with people. Seems to be maybe a little different for him, NFL versus college. So thanks for that permission, because again, a lot of us were like, oh man, I do this, is that not good? And I think what's fun is I wish and if while you're listening to this, I'm huge on Twitter. That's my go-to place, right? Tweet me at Mike Cunningham. I would love to know, don't give names, we're not here to call anybody out, but I would love to know, as we're going through these transformational, transactional, autocratic, did a coach like automatically pop up in your mind? Like, did your high school coach pop up like, oh yeah, autocratic, I couldn't tie my shoe without that man or woman telling me to tie my shoe, and I had to tie it a certain way, and whatever, those kind of things. I just want to know, like in my mind, that's what I'm doing. I'm like automatically like, oh yeah, this coach, or oh, this coach over here. Okay, number 4. So transformational, transactional, they kind of feel like they're on opposite ends of the coin here. Autocratic and
Democratic.
There it is. That was good. We didn't practice that at all. He nailed that one. That's good. All right. So democratic. Again, now maybe this one in today's world gives us a whole different thought in our head, fortunately or unfortunately, but as it relates to coaching styles, what's democratic mean?
So, and kind of as a caveat to this, what was very interesting about the research was that next to transformational leadership, coaches most identified with democratic leadership. So, again, in reading kind of the definition and understanding the kind of term, just democratic, democracy, again, it sounds like something that people generally want to identify with as a coach. And it's basically a leadership style that, think of the exact opposite of everything I just said with autocratic. So you are actively soliciting the input, thoughts, ideas, and opinions of all the team members before making team decisions, both large and small. So before you make a decision on what time you're going to leave for the track meet, get some opinions from your athletes, get some opinions from your assistant coaches on what's the best time. Before you select who's going to be in the final heat of the biggest race, again, we're getting more opinions. You're not going and unilaterally making those decisions without input. You're getting input from all of the stakeholders, taking all the different perspectives into consideration before making those decisions.
So this is literally the exact opposite of autocratic, right? So this is, you said big and small. So this is bringing in your team and saying, hey, here are the 3 designs for our uniforms the upcoming year. Which one should we go with? Hey, here's the schedule and our options for track meets that we're going to go to. Let's vote on it. Which ones do you guys want to go to? That kind of, is it all the way down to those levels as well?
Yeah, it's up to the individual coach and them kind of identifying where, they think their team and athletes can contribute. But, on teams that I've coached where we've had like a lot of leadership from the athletes, we've really solicited a lot of opinions on what plays we're running during the games. Should we make a change in our defense? Because we trusted their leadership abilities to be able to analyze what's going on and give us honest feedback on what they thought was best. For teams that were younger and didn't have a lot of experience, then, I tended towards what t-shirt design do you think? What would you like to have for post-game meal? To give them some leadership opportunities and start building their leadership practice, small decisions first, but still acting in a democratic way as a coach.
So how do you, on the democratic versus autocratic example, how do you, in your mind, how do you justify or come to the conclusion of, I am a 45-year-old, 20-year veteran coaching this sport or this event. I'm dealing, you're an 18-year-old, 19, I don't care if you're a senior, you're 22-year-old. I've been through this game 100 times. This is your first time going through this, but you want team buy-in. So how do you justify autocratic versus democratic in some of the more maybe important decisions? And what I mean by those kind of decisions, like training decisions, we get into this sometimes where our athletes, because they were coached differently, or in today's world, YouTube, they can go find any type of training online now, will come to a coach, a respected coach, a coach who has done it all, and say, well, I think I need to be trained this way. So how do you bounce back autocratic, democratic in those type of situations?
Yeah. So what I would kind of suggest for coaches is, trying to look for a balance, right? Other than transformational leadership, democratic leadership is the leadership style that athletes most identify that they want their coaches to practice. And that makes sense when you think about it, that, today's athletes have access to more information faster than ever before. And they have more platforms than ever before to be able to give their thoughts, opinions, and ideas. So it's natural that in the sports space, they're going to feel more comfortable and want to give their opinions to their coaches about a variety of different things relating to the team or their own training. Now, as a coach, I think it's important to then find a balance. If you have, athletes, if you have team members that want to contribute, that want to give their opinions, and like you said, the key word there is buy-in. You don't want to squelch that buy-in that comes with feeling like you're a part of decision making. So what I would kind of suggest for coaches is, again, you've been doing it a long time, you know what's best for training. You could still make an autocratic decision. You could still be the final decision maker, but you can listen to the input of select team members that you feel like have earned, your trust, or earned the right, or have the developed leadership abilities to give their opinions. just because you've asked for their opinions doesn't mean you need to change your decision. You know, you could still listen to it, engage in a conversation that's respectful, and, you know, kind of talk it through and still make a decision that you were going to, you know, go with in the first place. So I would say to coaches, you know, that's a good way to kind of get your athletes on board, is be willing to listen. You don't have to change your decision, but you can listen to them. And you know what? You might change your decision. You never know. But that can help with buy-in as well, because your athletes are, you know, feel like they're contributing to the decisions, or you're at least willing to listen to them and consider it.
Okay, I have like 1,000 questions that are coming up here, but we got to get through all 5 first, or I'll forget one. So let's get to the 5th one. So we had transformational, transactional, autocratic, democratic. Now this one, there's 5, so we can't have 2 sides of each coin. This one's going to be its own coin here. And this one, I thought, honestly, when I read it, Matthew, I thought this one was the most, I'm going to say controversial, like more like the most like, oh, wow, like who identifies this way, and who wouldn't automatically kind of cringe if their actual came out to be this way. So the 5th one is, and I don't even know if I'm pronouncing this right. Is it laissez-faire?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, sweet. Hey, you know, to all my college teachers, you're awesome. Thank you so much that I knew what that word is. So laissez-faire. So let's define laissez-faire and how that interacts here with coaching styles.
Yeah. So, you know, the reason why I wanted to put laissez-faire in there is because I wanted coaches to know if they had some laissez-faire tendencies. Now, laissez-faire is a leadership style that is not very commonly practiced by coaches at really any level of sports. You see it a little more in the professional ranks, because it's a leadership style that, you know, fundamentally is the coach taking a step back from coaching. It's allowing a lot of room for your team members to make decisions and contribute to the direction and vision of the team. It's basically taking democratic and applying it to all aspects of the team and taking another step back. You know, it's really allowing a lot of room for your athletes and your team members to be involved in decision making. And I think the connotation of that can sometimes be, well, coach is really hands off. Coach doesn't really care. Coach is disconnected. And I wanted coaches to know that it's okay if you're a laissez-faire leader, but you have to really know you're a laissez-faire leader. You have to believe in it. And you've also got to understand what the potential ramifications can be of laissez-faire leadership, of being too removed from decision-making and too removed from the vision and the mission of the team. So I just wanted coaches to be able to make sure that they were comfortable if they took that more hands-off approach, that they understood exactly the leadership decision that they were making.
So I think laissez-faire is Latin for hands off. That's kind of how I was learned. I could be wrong there. But you said you wanted to make sure coaches knew the repercussions if they fell into this style. What kind of repercussions are there?
So, you know, I think when you don't establish that laissez-faire is your leadership style, and you're doing that in an intentional way because of the athletes you have, that's why it's more common in the professionals, where, you know, you have a lot of veterans, a lot of strong leaders. So it might be appropriate for a coach to take more of a step back. You know, if you don't establish that, and there's not that understanding with your athletes, I think your athletes can feel like, you know, coach doesn't care, coach is too removed, coach is just kind of showing up and watching, coach isn't really engaged and involved. And that might not be what you're going for as a coach. You might really just be taking a step back to maybe evaluate or observe or get to know your team better. But your athletes might take that the wrong way. And so that's why it's really important that coaches identify that they're acting in a laissez-faire way and make sure that they're on the same page with their athletes.
Okay, so we said put a pin in it. Our question was, is it not necessarily trying to find, self-identify the leadership style and going all in it, or is it more important to find your majority leadership style and then sprinkling in some of the others at the appropriate times and densities?
Yeah, you know, I encourage coaches, and you know, and I wrote the book to be a menu. These are all like the leadership styles that we talked about. These are all the key behaviors. Now figure out which ones speak to you. Which ones do you identify with? I encourage coaches to kind of determine a foundational leadership style. For me, that was transformational leadership. That was the leadership style I most identified with. I identified with a lot of key elements. But then I sprinkled in other leadership styles. I tried to be democratic and get input from my athletes. There are some other behaviors that I tried to use, transactional at times. So I think I encourage coaches to kind of find that dominant leadership style if they have one. If they don't, that's okay. Not everybody does, but it's a little easier to build your leadership practice if you've identified that foundation. And then you kind of sprinkle in some other leadership styles from there. So that's kind of where I encourage coaches to start.
So I distrust, and I'm one of everybody in this country, by the way, perfection. And what I mean by that is when something, when you look at a picture and it looks, you just know it's been curated. It's, it's perfect. Every little, bow ties are in place and everything shine. There's something off about it because real life is not perfect, right? We're flawed human beings. And so Matthew, one of the things that I really loved about your book, like it for me, it gave you a ton of street cred here. Like I was like, okay, this dude's writing a PhD and he's writing a book. He's going to come at me saying how, he coached perfectly. He was only coached by people who coached perfectly. I was really impressed, Matthew, of your humility in the book. There's several examples that you gave of your own coaching where you had made the wrong decisions and it came back to bite you, and the lessons you learned from that. I just thought that was like, you wrote it, so you didn't have to put those in there. So I just love, your humility with that aspect there, Matthew. I think that's really important and really shows the truthfulness of what you're putting out here with the research. Okay, so I had a couple questions that came up from thinking about as you were describing those and some examples. We're talking a lot about coaches to athlete relationship and leadership. As you were discussing, I think it was actually in the democratic side there, it made me think about what's the application here for a coaching staff, a head coach and assistant coaches. And on the track side, we're very jealous of you basketball guys, by the way. You got, what do you got, like 10 coaches and 15 athletes, I think it is. That's at least what we tell ourselves. We're roughly dealing with 100 athletes, and a fully staffed coaching staff is 6, I believe it is nowadays. We can have 6 coaches. Our athlete to coach ratio is way skewed compared to you basketball guys out there. And you're a dog owner. People love dog owners. So remember I told you authenticity, man. I love it. I love it. That sounds like a big dog too. Is that a big dog?
Medium dog, big bark.
Yeah. That I have been described that way. I love that. That's good. So what is this? How is this applicable to coaching staffs, head coaches to assistant coaches, and vice versa? How an assistant coach works with a head coach?
Yeah, I think the head coach on any staff, they're going to kind of set the leadership tone, right? So, and I think it's important, and I encourage assistant coaches to understand the leadership style of your head coach. Is your head coach transformational? Is your head coach democratic? Understand, the leadership style your head coach is practicing. Take that as a cue, but not necessarily a direction. So that doesn't mean that because your head coach is transformational, you have to be transformational. If that's not in your personality, if that doesn't feel right to you as a leader, ultimately the most important thing is that you act in a way that's true to yourself as a leader. Now, if coach is democratic and you feel more autocratic, that's where you have to take the cue from your coach. You might not solicit a lot of opinions. You might just go to coach and say, coach, here's my opinion. And that might just be solely your opinion. But you got to respect that your head coach is going to solicit more than one opinion, even though that might not be how you would do it. So, and I think also that's important for head coaches. I think, I always encourage anybody who's hiring, and I would encourage this for anybody who's hiring in administration. If you're hiring coaches, if your coach is hiring assistants, when you're interviewing somebody, ask them their leadership style. Ask them to describe what their leadership style is. Find out, that tells you a lot about somebody. If somebody says they're a transformational leader, and now I know, okay, they really care about building positive relationships. They really care about inspiration and motivation. They really care about how they communicate. that gives you a lot of insight. And that can really help you build your staff in a really great way from a leadership perspective. Not only can you have people with a lot of different styles, which I think is important because, particularly in track, when you've got a lot of kids, they have a lot of different needs. So you don't necessarily want to have 6 coaches who all have the same leadership style. They're not going to be able to relate to all of the different kids. So I think it's important, particularly for track coaches, find out what are the leadership styles of your assistant. What are some of those key characteristics that could also help you kind of, figure out, what kids can they best coach, or, how can they help fill in some of the leadership gaps on the staff? What needs are we not meeting from our kids? So I think on both sides, it's really important to understand kind of where your head coach is coming from a leadership perspective, and for the head coach to really take that into consideration when selecting coaches.
Yeah, I agree. I thought that's why I really love this perceived versus actual, because as I'm thinking about coaching staffs and future coaching staffs, that's exactly what I thought. I thought of, in the present moment, wow, how important, how valuable would it be for you to know your coaches, your 3 coaches, your 6 coaches, whatever it is, your volunteer coaching staff, everybody who has input in your athletes. How important would it be to understand their perceived versus actual leadership styles? Wow, couldn't you be a better coaching staff and more effective right off the bat? And then that secondary, exactly what you said there, is the hiring. If I'm going to hire a coach, I want to make sure that maybe I believe in how they're coaching, their style, not their leadership style, but what they believe in as far as long to fast, or long to short, short to long, et cetera, all those kind of good things, but also their leadership style. Not only because I want to make sure maybe I'm bringing in a leadership style or styles that I want to gel with, but I should know that person's style and whether it will fit in. It's a great point. I did not think about that. If we're all transformational leaders, that's probably not good. You think we think about that being the quote unquote best one, or the one we most aspire to, but if everybody's actual style is transformational, we're going to lose out on some other things there. So I love that. That's really cool. Love that. Another topic that comes up a lot, Matthew, is the transfer portal. Have you heard of the transfer portal? It's, if you're in sports, I don't know how, in college sports specifically, I don't know how you haven't heard of the transfer portal, right? And there's just these, massive amounts of kids that are transferring. And I'm kind of pro athlete on this, by the way. So I'm kind of cool that they get to transfer. A student can transfer, so I don't know what necessarily the difference would be here, in my opinion. And I got to ask, when we're recording this, we're just coming off of the USTF CCCA convention. So it's like 1,500 primarily college coaches all together talking about everything, which also means we're griping about everything, right? And I asked because, the transfer portal, I hear more about in football. Like that's just where, everybody talks about, the Ohio State quarterback transferring and all this, Bo Nix now is transferring. It's crazy, things like that. So I asked several college coaches while I was with them, are we also seeing this in track? And everybody to a T was like, yes, there are hundreds, if not 1,000+ kids in the transfer portal. It's happening every day. There's new people. There's people who only recruit off of the transfer portal. It's amazing. But what I started thinking about was, as we're recruiting student athletes, and we'll just stick to the traditional high school to college. We won't talk too much about college to college necessarily, because I don't have much experience with there. But I started thinking about is, if I'm a coach and I know my actual leadership style, would it not be of benefit to recruit kids that either matched that style, or at the very least during recruiting being very open and transparent to the kid about my style? So if I'm an autocrat, if I, maybe my perceived is transformational, but my foundational leadership style is actually autocratic. If I express that to an athlete while I'm recruiting him or her and their parents, then they're making the decision in whole. It's like, oh, okay, coach is telling me he makes the decisions. So if I'm going to go there, I got to be okay with it. Wouldn't that help in decreasing the amount of transfers that you might have? I'm not sure there's a great question in there for you, Matthew. I may have just been thinking out loud there, but would there be benefit? Do you think there would be benefit of a coach knowing their actual foundational leadership style, and so they could be more transparent with recruits? Would that help create stickiness, less transfers?
Yeah, no, I think that's a great question, and I absolutely think it would. there's always going to be kids who want to transfer. They're not playing enough. They didn't like the campus life. They want to switch their major. There's always going to be reasons why kids transfer that are really out of coaches' control. But to kind of help combat some of this additional transferring that we've seen, I think it would be extremely helpful for coaches in the recruiting process to be very open and honest about their leadership style. How they coach, how they interact with their athletes, how they communicate, build relationships. The more information you could give up front, I think the better. Because I think one of the things that kind of contributes to transferring is kids come in, things immediately don't look how they thought they would. And it's an uphill from there for the coach to try to get them to stay or get them to buy in and be invested. That initial impression, if you've done the work to set the stage from the perspective of how you are going to be as a coach, your expectations, your rules, your standards, how you communicate, I think it gives you a better opportunity for your athletes to come in on day one and say, okay, this is a lot like what coach told me. Now, whether or not that works out for them, you'll know over the course of the season. But I think it gives you a better chance. And I think it also is going to help you more quickly develop a stronger culture and foundation, because everybody's walking into kind of the same thing. They knew what they were walking into. They had a pretty good idea, and they're more ready to kind of take it on in a new environment, as opposed to a number of new athletes kind of being taken aback that things are very different than what they thought. And now you're kind of working through some of those challenges as a coach.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking is there's certainly, to your point, going to be a subset of kids that transfer for other things that are outside of our control as coaches, right? You mentioned majors, homesickness, what have you. We don't have too much of the playing time issue, right? The quarterback who thought they were going to start and then they get beat out by first and second string, right? But we have more of, I think, more stylistic clashes, like, oh man, I thought coach was going to train me this way, or I thought I would have more input into my training than what I really have. So I just thought about that, like more openness and transparent to decrease the amount of transfers. Again, there's probably always, this is a big swath, right? But probably always going to be people that transfer out of every program. You're not going to quote unquote make everybody happy, but having that transparency from the get-go. I love how you put that. If you don't, the kid walks in, it's like, whoa, wait a minute, I didn't know we were going to have to be on time for track practice. What? So now it's an uphill, like, because then you start finding other things, right? Like, well, wait a minute, I remember him saying X, or she told me blah, blah, blah. You start finding reasons to get mad. What is the role of captains play in this? Because at face value, I feel like captains are automatically democratic, but as I've interviewed, hundreds of coaches out there, everybody does captains a little different. Some people have no captains. That seems more autocratic, but I'm willing to bet I'm wrong, that it's not an autocratic style if you have no captains. The reason I always get when I talk about no captains is the coach will say everybody's a captain. So that seems very democratic in that sense, right? But captains, go everything from, we don't have captains. We have a couple of coaches, several coaches have committees. So instead of captains, you have like this council, this committee of track of athletes we name 2 captains or 3 whatever. What's the role of captains in leadership style for coaches?
Yeah, I think captains can be a really good conduit between the coaches and the athletes. I think they can play a really important role in the team, but it depends on a couple of things. One, how much involvement does a coach allow captains to have? If you're a very autocratic leader, then you're probably not empowering the leadership abilities of your captains very much. You're probably just using them to disseminate information, or maybe help you kind of be, responsible for, let's get everybody there on time. Let's make sure everybody's engaged. It's not really contributing to team decisions. So I think as a coach, it's really important for you to identify, what are you hoping to get from your captains? What are your expectations for them? And then clearly communicating that, because some kids, there's that expectation of, I'm a captain now I'm going to tell coach what I think. I'm going to be the voice of the athletes and a team. That might not be what coach is looking for based on coach's leadership style. So I think establishing that up front, being open about that in the communication process with your athletes when they're chosen is really important. Kind of establishing their role as captains, it's really helpful. Because I've seen it both ways where, kids are selected as captains and it's not what they thought it was. And it can create a more fractured relationship with the coach. So I think that's really important up front. And I think also, I encourage coaches, don't necessarily just look to your most accomplished or best athletes to be leaders, to be the captains. They might not be comfortable in that role. There might be other kids on the team who have other leadership skills or abilities that might be better suited to that role. So really, if you're invested in having captains, take a critical look at what leadership abilities of your athletes you value, and then trying to figure out a way to put those kids, regardless of maybe their talent level or their accomplishments, in a leadership role to some extent, so that you can kind of maximize the impact that captains can have.
I'm glad you brought that up. That was actually, as we were discussing, Matthew, having you on the podcast, that was one of my first questions, themes that I thought of was on the athlete side as a coach's purview. How much of leadership is a talent level identifier? And I don't mean talent like talent is the talent of leadership. I've never heard of a walk-on kid for basketball, football, track, who became captain their freshman year. It's always the number one recruit that signs. That's our captain. That seems not cool. That seems like if leadership is really leadership, then it's not. It should be disembarked from talent level. It could be your most talented kid or kids, but there has to be other ways of identifying talent. I'm sorry, identifying leadership. So my original question was, how dependent is leadership on talent? How interplayed are those? It's not a great question, I know. I'm putting you on the spot here a little bit.
It depends. And I'll kind of give an example. When I was a coach at Dartmouth, our best player, he was tremendous. He was the Ivy League Player of the Year. He was a tremendous kid, just unbelievable. He was not a captain for us, and he wasn't very outgoing. He wasn't very vocal, but that doesn't mean he wasn't still a leader.
Mm-hmm.
I think sometimes coaches forget that leadership isn't all about communication, that a lot of it is your behaviors. And he was a tremendously hard worker. He was always in the gym. He had developed over the course of his 4 years in college, probably as much as, if not more than any player that I coached. But he just wasn't vocal about it. So it was important that we valued those leadership characteristics as well, so that he knew he was a leader, just in a little bit of a different way than maybe he thought a leader should be. But also it was important for us to say, okay, he still has an important leadership role on the team. He's just not comfortable being a captain. And we had some other guys on the team who maybe weren't as talented as he was or as accomplished, but they had the respect of their teammates to be able to give the more vocal leadership, those verbal cues that they were more comfortable giving, and their teammates would listen to them. And it was important for us to identify that, first off, you could be a leader and not be a captain. And also, we wanted to put guys in a captain's role who were comfortable with it and who had the respect of their teammates, so that there was that maximal impact of what they were saying as captains.
I mean, you can see why we had Dr. Raidbard on the show, right? I mean, come on. So love this. This is highly important to what you're doing as a track and field coach. You go to these professional development, we're just coming off USTFCCA. So we had a lot of, how to coach the long jump, how to coach distance runners, et cetera. And we also, and I love that the USTFCCA does this, we had leadership classes there as well, how to be a better head coach, et cetera. So that's why this is so important. This is a part of your puzzle, right? If you think about your life and career as a puzzle, this is one of the pieces, and maybe it's a little bit larger piece than some of the other pieces as well. So I love that. So Matthew, one of my bosses here, his famous thing, and maybe he only started it when I started putting input in here, but I'll tell him something and he loves to look at me and goes, okay, so what? And he doesn't mean it rudely. Like he's saying, okay, that's great. Because I'm a big information guy, right? So I'm always like trying to disseminate information. So I'll say, okay, so what? So what's the action step? So what does that mean? What do we do with this information? So you just gave us great information. We were talking about perceived versus actual leadership styles, and you just gave us 5 leadership styles. So maybe we have half the information right now. If we're listening right now, we can now put maybe words to our perceived style. Like we can say, oh, okay, I never I knew how you preferred to coach and lead. Now I can see that that's a transactional style. Okay, that's half the puzzle. So what? So what do we do next? What's the next steps? I'm actually going to give the first two steps. I'm going to steal your thunder because the third step's really important, but you got to explain this one. So for me, my opinion here, and Matthew will agree with me, trust me. I think the next immediate steps are, as you listen to Matthew explaining those different foundational leadership styles, is starting with putting those words to it. That, okay, here's my perceived. You got to take the next step now. You got to connect the dots here and start working on what your actual is. So for me, my suggestion is go buy the book. It's an economical book. I ain't how you hear, how can you doing $100 books out here, man? And it's chock full. I love that it's not a 300 pager. Like, it is, the fluff ain't there, guys. It is right here in what I think it was 100. Yeah, it's 100 pages. You can do this on your next trip, your next bus ride, your next flight for a track meet. So I think it's buying the book and reading the book. How many times do we have these huge libraries and it's all books we ain't read, right? So it's always important. You buy the book, but you got to read the book, right? So read the book. Matthew expands on what we talked about here tremendously. And what would be maybe a next step, Matthew? It's one thing to read it, one thing to buy it, one thing to read it. What do we do next with that information as we're starting to understand our perceived versus actual leadership style?
Yeah, so I think what we talked about today with perceived and actual is so important. Getting those aligned, figuring out the leader that you are. It's so important that you establish that, because then once you read, as you progress through the book, you'll start getting those tools to then be able to go out and do it. And that's just that key. And I think that's where a lot of coaches, their leadership style gets kind of lost is, okay, I want to be a transformational leader. I know about transformational leadership. Okay, I'm going to go out and be a transformational leader, but you got to get the tools. And I give lots of ways to kind of go out and be different types of leadership styles, give coaches those tools. And that's a lot of the work I also do outside of the book is, helping coaches through workshops and trainings. And, I have a survey where, it's the survey I gave coaches, and you take the survey, it'll tell me what your perceived leadership style is, and it'll tell me what your actual leadership style is. And based off those results, I'll help you, work to kind of figure out how we can bridge that gap and get you moving forward. So, just a lot of different ways to kind of move coaches' practice forward. But, again, it's about kind of starting at that foundation of where am I as a leader? Where do I see myself? And then going from there.
Matthew, I love it, man. And I'm so thankful that we got to do this. It's important for me, for our listeners and for our coaching body to think outside the box. And for track and field specifically, we can be very boxy. We can stay in that box. So, I love when we first connected that I had some hesitation. I'm like, basketball, we're jealous of basketball. What's he going to come and talk to us about on track coaches? But I love that you are from basketball and not track and field. That's part of being outside the box, seeing things differently, working with different types of athletes, working with different quantities of athletes, et cetera. So I'm just so thankful that, you'd be here today and share your research. I'm assuming that it took a lot of time and a lot of sleepless nights to put it all together. You were dealing with coaches, so I know it did. But I'm just so thankful, man. Anything we missed before we sign off today? I want to make sure we give as much complete picture for our coaches out there.
Yeah, I really appreciate the kind words about kind of some of the examples I use in the book. But, I tell coaches, I was a college basketball coach, but I tried to write the book for coaches at all levels in all sports. My lens was college basketball. The examples that I use in the book are from my career, but the reason why I did that was because the mistakes I made are not exclusively college basketball coaching leadership mistakes. They're mistakes that I've seen coaches at all levels in all sports make that I want to help them try to correct. So that may have been my lens, basketball, but I really hope that when everybody reads the book, that they see that this is not a basketball leadership book. It's a leadership book that I just happened to write when I was a basketball coach. So I hope people will pick up the book and enjoy it, and that they'll be able to see how all these different scenarios and leadership styles and examples relate to, them as a coach, their sport, and the age group that they coach.
I love it. As coaches, we're always asking our athletes to get just 1% better every day. Well, here's your opportunity, coach, to get better 1% every day. Lead like a pro, effective leadership styles for athletic coaches. Again, I'll have all the links and stuff like that in the show notes. And Matthew, thank you again, man. Really appreciate your time today.
Thanks so much for having me. This was great. I really appreciate it.
Awesome. Appreciate you.